Cheryl Dorsey, retired LAPD sergeant and author of the forthcoming book, The Confidence Chronicles, The Greatest Crime Story Never Told, and Brittany Packnett-Cunningham, founder of Love and Power Works, an MSNBC contributor. Thank you, ladies, for opening up the show with me today. Look, when we talk about violence in cities, I include police violence in that, because while we're seeing some of the gun violence, we also see police brutality. So, Cheryl, I want to start with you and get your reaction to the Derek Chauvin sentencing yesterday. A lot of people are split on this. I've seen some people say, 22 years was not enough. I've seen other people think this is justice. I'm curious your thoughts.
Well, listen, it's difficult to quantify the value of someone's life, and understanding that Chauvin is a first-time offender, and so there are sentencing guidelines that have to come into play. And while we may not like it, it has to come into play for him the same way we would want it to come into play if it were a black person who was a first-time offender accused of murder. Now, I'm pleased that he got the 22 years. I don't think he'll do all 22 because this is state prison, and so he'll probably only really do half of that. It's a great first step, but listen, absent the end to qualified immunity, all of this other talk is, it's sexy and it sounds good, but it does little to deter the bad behavior, to stop the Derek Chauvins who collect 19 personnel complaints, or in the case of the Columbus police officer Adam Coy, 90 personnel complaints over his career until he shot and killed Andre Hill, an unarmed black man. So it's a good first step.
All right. Well, Brittany, she says it's a good first step. I want you to take a listen to Rodney Floyd, George Floyd's brother, his reaction yesterday. Take a listen.
This 22-year sentence they gave this man, it's a slap on the wrist. We serving a life sentence and not having him in our life, and that hurts me to death. And looking at his daughter, beautiful daughter Gianna, in her video, saying the first video, my dad changed the world. He did change the world, but at the end result, he gets a slap on the wrist.
I mean, I understand people feeling this way. Look, I know people who did more time than that for a quarter ounce of weed, and so take a man's life. I get the frustration. What are your thoughts, Britt?
I certainly get the frustration. It's another example of just how hypocritical the system is, of just how different this system is depending on your zip code, your skin color, your first language, and your offense. Look, the fact of the matter is accountability is extremely rare when it comes to police officers killing people. It's even more rare when the police kill black people. But frankly, the Floyd family deserves accountability, but I'm very sure that they'd give 100 years back if they could have George back with them, actually living his life and loving on his daughter. You heard it said before, what really is a life worth? What is the value of a life? It's not 22 and a half years. It's not 100 years. George Floyd's life was priceless. So it's easy for us to talk about whether or not 22 and a half is too much or too little. It's much harder to reckon with the system that shouldn't have been allowed to kill George Floyd in the first place. The question is not if we've given Derek Chauvin enough time. The question is always, how do we prevent the next George Floyd?
Absolutely. We're going to be talking about this a lot more later in the hour. So I kind of want to switch gears and get back to crime, because it's interesting, right, that we're talking about an uptick in crime. You just heard the rhetoric circa 1983 that's being, repeated now. Cheryl, I am a little concerned because I know there are people in neighborhoods who have concerns about the violence they've seen. It's interesting that this is happening at the time of defund the police. We have to get to the root of the problem. Why do you think we're seeing an uptick in crime happening right now?
I think it's a combination of things, and we have to understand that police officers are the backbone. Patrol particularly are the backbone of any police department, and this reminds me of back in the day when I was on LAPD, when officers' feelings were hurt, and they had the term blue flu, where officers openly talked about slow response to radio calls. You can break a police chief if response time is low, if you're not clearing crimes, if you're not responding to high priority calls, shootings in progress, murder, robbery. And so officers now we see across these 18,000 police departments are butthurt because, they can't run willy-nilly through a police department and abuse with reckless abandon. So they're stepping away from specialized units, too cowardly to quit outright the department, but they're stepping away from units on the Columbus Police Department, the Rapid Response Team, an entire platoon of SWAT officers walked away in Miami. And so I don't think it's a coincidence. And listen, bad guys know that cops aren't responding, that they're not coming out when they're capering. And so I think it's a combination of things.
And according to Police Forum, there are some departments across the country who are having trouble filling police positions. So, Brittany, look, 6 in 10 Americans say that crime is a huge concern for them. Biden came out with his plan that focused on gun violence, but it did also have, other things in it, community initiatives, money from the American Recovery Act to help, streamline some of the community resources. We know his role in the 1994 crime bill. I'm just curious what you think about his plan, and is it right to focus exclusively on gun violence?
Well, I do think that gun violence is a major part of the problem. And what I'm glad to see in this bill is that there is real investment in the issues of gun violence at the community level, because those are the things that we truly know work. What disheartens me is the amount of additional police funding we see in this bill, in a way that, to the point that you made in your opening monologue, Tiffany, could rival some of the conversations that we were having 10, 20, 30 years ago during the tough on crime era. And it's going to be really important for Democrats to resist the urge to allow Republicans to create the narrative and drive the conversation. Because Republicans are not necessarily talking specifically about gun violence. They keep putting up crime in big capital letters because they want to put Willie Horton on steroids and use the same boogeyman that they did in the 80s and 90s. Because they don't want to fund community intervention programs. They want people to have more guns, not less. That's the party that doesn't want to pay people a living wage and invest in social services to actually combat the economic depression and isolation that people faced during the pandemic. So Republicans are going to want to drive a conversation that ignores the fact that this is gun violence. They're going to want to ignore the root causes of homicide and gun assaults. We in the movement and folks across communities that are actually dealing with this gun violence, they are demanding overwhelmingly that communities are being invested in. Live Free, which is a coalition of community-based gun violence fighters, has done a survey, and 68% of those that they surveyed want those community-based interventions funded and promoted first. So I think it's critically important that we pay attention to gun violence because it is a major part of the issue.
Yeah, but addressing the supply doesn't necessarily always address the demand. So I think that's where the community investment part comes back. Cheryl, I want to ask you, because I grew up during the dawn of the crack epidemic, and drive-bys were a regular thing. So it's hard for me to compare what we see now to what I saw when I was growing up. What's your take on, do you really think there is an uptick in crime, the way that Republicans are framing it?
I don't necessarily think that there's an uptick in crime, and I can tell you that I know firsthand, statistics can be manipulated. And so I think that this is, again, what officers, police departments, police chiefs, those who are savvy, try to do is pull back, make communities suffer just a little bit, so you'll miss that heavy-handedness, those overzealous cops who are abusing their authority in your communities. And then when you cry uncle, they come back times 10 with more militarization, more heavy-handed elephant hunters who are now preying on an unsuspecting public, because when you ask for more, you don't always get what it is that you're really wanting, which is quality of life issues addressed.
Right. It's kind of scary to hear Senator Kennedy there say we need to bring back stop and frisk. But I imagine we'll stay on the front lines of that battle. Brittany Packnett-Cunningham will stay with us for the next hour. And thank you so much, retired LAPD Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey.